A blonde walked into a library, went to the counter and said, "I'll have a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke." The librarian looked at her and said, "Miss, this is a library." The blonde gasped, looked around, and whispered, "Sorry, I'll have a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke." Two blondes were driving to Disneyland. They saw a sign that said Disneyland left, so they turned around and went home. A blonde's computer froze. She looked at it for 5 minutes, then whispered, "Maybe if I don't move, it will thaw." A blonde called tech support and said, "My computer says press any key, but I can't find the any key." The technician said, "Try hitting the spacebar." She said, "Oh, you mean the invisible one." A blonde saw her reflection in the mirror and said, "I know her, but I can't remember where from." A blonde was taking a driving test. The examiner said, "What does a yellow traffic light mean?" She replied, "Slow down." He said, "Good, what does a red light mean?" She said, "Stop." He said, "And green?" She smiled proudly, "Go faster so I don't miss it." Two blondes found a pair of tracks in the forest. One said, "Those are deer tracks." The other said, "No, those are bear tracks." They were still arguing when the train hit them. A blonde got a job painting road lines. On the first day, she painted 2 kilometers. The second day, 1 kilometer. The third day, half a kilometer. Her boss asked, "What happened?" She said, "I keep getting farther from the paint can." A blonde went into a store to buy curtains. She told the clerk, "I need curtains for my computer." The clerk said, "Why would your computer need curtains?" She said, "Because it has windows." A blonde walked into an electronics shop and said, "I want that TV." The clerk said, "We don't sell to blondes." So she dyed her hair brown, came back and said, "I'll take that TV." The clerk said, "I told you we don't sell to blondes." She said, "How did you know?" He said, "That's a microwave." A blonde locked her keys in the car. She tried for hours to open it with a coat hanger. Finally, she gave up and called her friend, who said, "Why don't you just use the spare?" She said, "I can't, the roof's stuck open and it's raining." A blonde sat down at her desk and said, "My brain is like the internet, too many tabs open and half of them frozen." A blonde was pulled over for speeding. The officer said, "License, please." She said, "I wish you people would make up your mind. One day it's a driver's license, the next it's a fishing license." A blonde told her friend she bought a puzzle that said 3 to 5 years. She finished it in 6 months and proudly said, "See, I'm faster than average." A blonde was watching the news. The reporter said, "A man drowned while crossing a river." The blonde said, "Why didn't they build a bridge for him first?" A blonde tried to wash her hair with body wash. When her friend asked why, she said, "Because the shampoo bottle said for dry hair and my hair was wet." A blonde called the airline to ask how long the flight from New York to Los Angeles was. The agent said, "Just a minute." The blonde said, "Thanks," and hung up. A blonde bought an AM radio but returned it the next day, complaining, "It only works in the morning." A blonde saw a sign at the zoo that said, "Please do not feed the animals." She said, "Who would be that mean? They look hungry," and started passing out sandwiches. A blonde's house caught on fire. She called the fire department and shouted, "Hurry, my house is burning down." The operator said, "How do we get there?" She said, "Big red truck." A blonde ordered a pizza. The clerk asked if she wanted it cut into 6 or 8 slices. She said, 6, I could never eat 8. A blonde heard someone say they were running a marathon. She said, "Wow, how many seasons is that show?" A blonde decided to lose weight by walking 3 kilometers every day. After 2 weeks, she was 42 kilometers from home. A blonde went to the eye doctor. He pointed to the chart and said, "Can you read the bottom line?" She said, "Sure, made in China." A blonde wanted to surprise her boyfriend by painting the walls while he was out. When he got home, she was standing in the corner shivering. He asked why. She said, "The paint can said, for best results use 2 coats." A blonde told her friend she failed the pregnancy test. Her friend asked how she knew. She said, I got an F. A blonde stood at an automatic door that wouldn't open. She waved, clapped, jumped, nothing. Finally, a man came and said, you have to step closer. She said, but it says automatic, not manual. A blonde called Apple support and said, my iPhone won't turn on. They asked, did you press the side button? She said, yes, I pressed it, hugged it, even encouraged it. Nothing. A blonde told the cashier, please hurry, my car is running. The cashier said, oh, it's fine. She said, no, it's in the parking lot. A blonde was playing hide and seek. After 2 hours, nobody found her, so she texted, am I still it? A blonde saw a job posting for night security. She applied and asked, so, do I just watch Netflix all night? A blonde was reading the dictionary for fun. She said, so many words, I wonder how it ends. A blonde and her friend were arguing about whether the sun or the moon is more important. She said, the moon, obviously, it shines at night when it's dark. The sun just comes out during the day when it's already bright. A blonde walked into a hardware store and asked the clerk, do you have any of those things, you know, that make the water hot? The clerk said, you mean a kettle? She said, no, the thing you put under the kettle to make it hot. He stared at her for a moment and whispered, a stove. She said, yes, that's the word. Do you have a portable one? A blonde called her friend and said, my phone is acting weird. It keeps saying the memory is full. Her friend asked, well, what do you have on it? She said, pictures of my dog. How many? She said, just one, but it's a very big dog. A blonde took her broken car to the mechanic. He said, you have water in your carburetor. She said, that's impossible. He said, well, I'm telling you, there's water in there. She said, no, you don't understand. I drove through the lake days ago. A blonde visiting a doctor said, Doc, I think I need glasses. He asked, you certainly do. This is a bank. A blonde tried to fill out a crossword puzzle for the first time. She stared at one clue for half an hour. Finally, she cried out, 7-letter word, starts with A, ends with E, and I think it means living. What is it? Someone across the room said, abode. She said, no, that can't be it. That doesn't sound alive at all. Two blondes were watching a movie. A man on the screen was about to jump from a skyscraper. One blonde said, I bet you $5 he jumps. The other said, okay, but I don't think he will. He jumped. The second blonde sighed and said, all right, here's $5. The first blonde said, I can't take it. I've already seen the movie. The second blonde said, me too, but I didn't think he'd jump again. A blonde was babysitting and decided to help the kids with homework. One child said, we are learning Roman numerals. The blonde nodded proudly and said, oh, I know those. X means 10, V means 5, and OMG means shock. A blonde tried meditation to relax. She sat on the floor, closed her eyes, and whispered, Om. After 10 minutes, she opened her eyes and said, well, nothing happened. Maybe I should reboot myself. A blonde saw a man painting a huge wall. She said, wow, that must be tough work. He replied, actually, it's relaxing. She said, how do you make the paint stick to the wall? He said, you just brush it on. She gasped, that's genius. I always thought walls came colored from nature. A blonde walked into a pharmacy and said, I need something for my headache. The pharmacist asked, have you tried aspirin? She said, yes, but I can't open the bottle. A blonde was staring at a carton of orange juice for 5 minutes. When asked why, she said, it says concentrate. A blonde called her friend and said, I bought a GPS and it keeps telling me to turn left, but my steering wheel only goes right. A blonde got stuck in an elevator for hours. When they finally rescued her, she said, it was terrifying. I pushed the button that says door open, but the door didn't open. I pushed the one that says door close, and it didn't close. I think those buttons are just for decoration. A blonde bought a brand new car, and the next day she came back to the dealership furious. It won't go, she cried. The mechanic walked outside, looked at the car and said, "Ma'am, you're in the back seat." A blonde walked into a pet store and said, "I want a goldfish." The employee asked, "Do you want an aquarium?" She said, "I don't care what sign it is." A blonde called 911 because her house was leaking. The operator said, "Where is the leak coming from?" She said, "From my roof." The operator said, "Do you know where on the roof?" She replied, "Yes, right above the ceiling." A blonde's laptop wasn't working. The IT guy asked, "Is it plugged in?" She said, "Of course, do you think I'm stupid?" He asked, "Then why is the other end not in the wall?" She froze, looked at the cable, and whispered, "Well, I didn't want to use your electricity." A blonde stood on the balcony, staring at the street. Her neighbor asked, "What are you doing?" She said, "Waiting for the sun to set." "Why not just check the time?" She smiled, "Oh, I want to see it personally. The sun probably appreciates the attention." A blonde told her friend she was taking a baking class. On her first day, the instructor asked her to preheat the oven to 180 degrees. She rotated the whole oven until it faced the wall and said, "Done." A blonde's coworker asked her, "Do you know what's worse than Friday the 13th? She said, "Monday the everyday." A blonde kept hearing strange noises in her car. Her mechanic checked everything and said, "There's nothing wrong. The car is perfectly fine." She said, "Okay, but then why do those cars behind me keep honking?" A blonde took her laptop to the ocean to clear her mind. A wave splashed over it, and the computer died instantly. She stared at it and said, "Okay, now my mind is clear, but the laptop still looks confused." A blonde got a job at a bakery. Her first task was to make cookies. The owner returned an hour later and asked, "Why haven't you baked anything?" She said, "Because the recipe says to let the dough rest, and I don't want to wake it up." A blonde had trouble sleeping. She read that counting sheep helps. After 1 hour she said, "Screw this, I keep losing track after the fluffy one jumps." A blonde's friend bought a smart fridge. She said, "Mine is smarter, it never tells me what to do." A blonde called her boyfriend and said, "I think I locked my keys inside the car again." He said, "Okay, do you have the spare?" She said, "Yes, but it's inside too. I didn't want the key to get lonely." A blonde wanted to surprise her best friend for her birthday. She bought a cake, candles, balloons, and a giant card. On the card she wrote, "Happy Anniversary." Her friend said, "It's my birthday." She said, "But it can still be a happy anniversary of your birth." A blonde went shopping and bought 6 identical shirts. The cashier said, "Wow, you must really like that style." She replied, "It's not that, I just don't want my washing machine to judge me." A blonde got tired of losing her keys, so she taped them to her phone. Then she lost her phone. She said, "Okay, next time I'll tape the phone to the keys." A blonde's boss told her to work smarter, not harder. She took off her shoes, put her feet on the desk and said, "Perfect, I feel smarter already." A blonde bought a smart toaster. She plugged it in and said politely, "Toast, please." When nothing happened, she said, "Wow, this thing is passive-aggressive." A blonde got stuck in traffic. She called a friend and said, "I'm so frustrated, there's a line of cars behind me." Her friend said, "That's normal." She said, "Not in my driveway." A blonde said she wanted to start a podcast. Her friend asked, "What will it be about?" She said, "Talking." He said, "About what?" She said, "Talking about talking." A blonde returned a book to the library and said, "I didn't like it, too many characters and not enough pictures." The librarian said, "This is a dictionary." A blonde decided to go on a diet and bought a scale. She stepped on it, frowned, shook her head, stepped off, stepped on again and said, maybe if I stand on one foot I'll weigh less. Then she tried it. She gained 0.2 kg. She shouted, how? A blonde went to a psychic who said, you will soon find great fortune. She said, perfect, can I get an advance? A blonde ordered a salad at a restaurant. When it arrived, she said, this looks healthy, can you deep fry it for me? A blonde ran into a glass door at the mall. She stood up, fixed her hair and said, well, at least that window is clean. You're welcome, everyone. A blonde got a haircut and asked the stylist if she could keep the hair. The stylist said, why? She said, I might want it back someday. A blonde saw a sign that said, wet paint. She touched it. It was wet. She gasped and said, wow, they weren't kidding. A blonde took a first aid class. When the instructor said, check the patient's pulse, she asked, do I need my phone for that? A blonde told her friend, my GPS keeps saying recalculating. That means it's rewriting my destiny. A blonde went skydiving. Before she jumped, the instructor said, count to 10 and pull the cord. She said, got it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. The instructor screamed, you skipped 6. She said, I always skip it. It's unlucky. A blonde entered a talent show. During the audition, she just stood there smiling. The judge asked, so what's your talent? She said, being photogenic. A blonde was confused by the push and pull labels on a door, so she tried both. Eventually, she sighed and said, this door is too moody for me. A blonde read the label on her coffee. Caution, hot. She nodded and said, good, I hate cold warnings. A blonde got tired of buying expensive shampoo, so she switched to baby shampoo because, as she said, it's made for Barbies, so obviously it's gentler for adults too. Her friend asked, so how do you like it? The blonde said, it's pretty good, but I kind of expected it to grow into adult shampoo after a while. A blonde was filling out an online form. For the security question it asked, mother's maiden name. She wrote, Mom. The website rejected it. Confused, she said, wow, this site doesn't even know my mom's last name. The internet is so dumb. A blonde bought a high-end coffee maker. When she realized she needed to grind the beans herself, she returned it and said, I don't have time to teach it. A blonde tried to bake cookies from a recipe. It said, place cookies 2 inches apart. She put one in the kitchen and the other in the bathroom. A blonde called her friend and said, I think my washing machine is broken. I put in a load, but it's just sitting there staring at me. Her friend asked, did you close the door? She said, oh, it needs privacy. A blonde was sitting at her computer when her friend asked what she was doing. She said, downloading my emails. Her friend said, that's not how email works. She said, then why does it say downloading messages? Don't confuse me. A blonde complained her fridge wasn't getting cold. The repairman checked it and said, you've set the temperature to warm. She said, well, sometimes I want my food to rest. A blonde walked into a gym for the first time. She saw a man lifting weights and asked, does that actually make you stronger? He said, yeah. She said, wow, and all this time I thought people only did it for the selfies. A blonde bought a smart home assistant. On the first day she said, hey device, turn on the lights. Nothing happened. She repeated, turn on the lights. Still nothing. After 10 tries she said, it must only work with smart people. A blonde told her friend she wanted to get in shape. Her friend said, try jogging. The blonde said, outside, in public, where people can see me breathing hard. A blonde locked herself in her bathroom because the doorknob came off. When rescue arrived 3 hours later, she said, I wasn't actually scared. I just didn't know if the outside world still existed. A blonde was complaining about her new phone. She said, it keeps saying my storage is full. Her friend asked, do you have a lot of videos? She said, no, just one, but it's very high quality. A blonde visited a museum. She looked at a sign that said, exhibit temporarily closed, and whispered, or did it die? A blonde asked a flight attendant, how do airplanes stay up? The attendant said, they use lift. The blonde asked, lift, like the elevator? A blonde was checking out at a grocery store when the cashier asked, paper or plastic? She replied, what are we talking about? Two blondes visited a farm. One said, look at those cows. The other said, those aren't cows, those are sheep. The farmer walked by and said, actually, those are goats. Both blondes whispered, we said goats. A blonde wanted to eat healthier, so she bought a blender. Her friend asked, what do you use it for? She said, ice cream, I like it smooth. A blonde's friend asked her how she liked her new electric toothbrush. The blonde said, it's good, but it only works when I touch my teeth with it. I guess it's motion activated. A blonde bought a candle that said, lasts 40 hours. 2 days later, she returned it furious and said, it didn't even last 2 days. A blonde went to the post office and asked how to send a letter internationally. The clerk said, just put an international stamp. She said, which one? Spain, Italy, Earth. A blonde asked her friend how to keep bread fresh. Her friend said, put it in the freezer. She later said, it worked so well, but now the bread is rock hard. Do I thaw it or chisel it? A blonde was learning to drive. She said to her instructor, wow, the road is so narrow. He said, that's because you're driving on the sidewalk. A blonde was so proud, she saved money on groceries that she posted online. I got 12 eggs for €3. That's like 25 cents each. Someone replied, actually, that's exactly 25 cents each. She said, wow, I should buy a calculator. A blonde bought a GPS navigation app, but hated the voice. She said, it sounds bossy. I want one that uses suggestions. She imagined, maybe consider turning left, only if you feel ready. A blonde saw a vending machine that accepted Apple Pay. She pressed her iPhone against the screen and whispered, you can do it. The vending machine did nothing. She said, wow, not even technology believes in me. A blonde bought a robot vacuum. The next day she called customer service and said, it keeps hitting the same wall. The agent asked, is that where dirt usually is? She said, no, that's where I usually am. A blonde tried to return a pair of shoes because they didn't fit. The clerk said, did you try walking in them? She said, yes, but I think they only walk left. A blonde went to a psychic who said, you will be very successful. The blonde said, great, but can you be more specific, like a hint? The psychic said, your future is unclear. The blonde said, then how come your prices are so clear? A blonde ordered coffee at a cafe. The barista asked, room for cream? She said, no thanks, I'll drink it here. A blonde was learning how to cook pasta. The instructions said, boil water. She stared at the pot and said, come on water, you can do this. A blonde placed her phone under the pillow while sleeping. Her friend asked why. She said, so I can dream of messages. A blonde walked into an expensive clothing store and asked if they had anything in her size. The clerk said, what size are you? She said, Instagram small. A blonde saw a sign on the street that said falling rocks. She looked around and said, where? A blonde saw a makeup palette with 32 colors. She said, do you expect me to use all of these? I only have 2 eyelids. A blonde dropped her phone into the toilet. Her friend asked, did you put it in rice? She said, no, I used pasta, I didn't have rice. A blonde tried to unclog her sink with baking soda and vinegar. She poured in the vinegar, added the soda, and it fizzed everywhere. She screamed, my sink is having a panic attack. A blonde bought a smartwatch. After 2 days, she returned it and said, it keeps telling me to stand up. I don't like being judged. A blonde wanted to prank her boyfriend, so she hid behind the door for 20 minutes. When he came home and opened it, she said, boo. He didn't react. She said, why didn't you scream? He said, because you texted me earlier saying you were planning a surprise. A blonde saw a man fishing and asked, how many fish have you caught? He said, none so far. She said, then you should try a different sport. A blonde was trying to decide whether to go to the gym or stay home. She made a pros and cons list. Under pros of going, she wrote, health. Under cons, she wrote, movement. A blonde used her ironing board as a surfboard in a pool. Her friend shouted, that's not how ironing works. She replied, well, that's not how surfing works either, so we're even. A blonde's friend showed her a globe. The blonde pointed to Australia and said, is that upside down? A blonde saw a sign at a hotel that said breakfast included. She said, OMG, free food, where do they keep it? A blonde bought a drone. She sent it up and then panicked because she couldn't remember the return to owner spell. A blonde got excited about online shopping because her package arrived earlier than expected. She said, Amazon must love me, it knows I'm impatient. A blonde's friend asked why she always carries 2 phones. She said, in case one runs out of battery, the other can call for help. A blonde was complaining that her car takes too long to warm up. Her dad said, start it earlier. She said, I can't, I'm not there earlier. A blonde asked a lifeguard, how deep is the water? He said, it varies. She asked, okay, but like, what's the average? A blonde ordered soup. When it arrived, she said, hold on, let me cool it down. Then she blew on the spoon before dipping it in. A blonde wanted to impress her date by cooking a steak. She Googled how long to cook steak. The answer said 4 to 6 minutes. So she cooked it for 4 minutes, then 6 minutes, then 4 minutes again. It became charcoal. She said, wow, steak cooking is unpredictable. A blonde stood in the rain holding an umbrella but didn't open it. Someone asked why. She said, oh, this is just for sun protection. A blonde asked her friend, if you drive backwards, does the odometer go down? Her friend said no. The blonde said, then how do people stay young? A blonde was trying to assemble a piece of furniture from IKEA. The instructions said, insert screw A into hole B. She stared at it for 10 minutes and said, why can't they just say, put the pointy thing in the round thing? A blonde called the fire department and shouted, MY kitchen is on fire. The operator said, ma'am, how do we get there? The blonde said, don't you guys use those big trucks anymore? A blonde walked into an airline office and said, I want to fly to New York. The agent said, one way or round trip? She replied, definitely round trip, I'm not walking back. A blonde was trying to buy a smartphone case. The employee asked, what model is your phone? She said, pink. A blonde tried to make hard-boiled eggs. She put the eggs in boiling water and set a timer. When the timer beeped, she opened the pot and found no eggs. She panicked and shouted, they evaporated. Her roommate opened the fridge and found the eggs still sitting in the carton. A blonde was typing on her laptop when a pop-up said, do you want to save changes? She whispered, no, I want to become new. A blonde told her friend she was learning Spanish. Her friend asked, how is it going? She said, great, I finished the alphabet, Now I just have to learn the words. A blonde tried to go vegan. She bought plant-based meat, plant-based cheese, plant-based milk. Then she called her friend, whispering, "Do they make plant-based plants too? These real ones taste weird." A blonde was at a pet store looking at fish. She said, "Do they come with instructions?" The worker said, "Just feed them and keep the water clean." She said, "Okay, but which side is the water?" A blonde entered a talent show and said her special skill was time travel. The judge asked her to demonstrate. She said, "I already did, last week." A blonde asked a mechanic, "Why is my car making a weird noise?" The mechanic asked, "When does it happen?" She said, "Whenever I'm inside it." A blonde thought she lost her phone. She panicked for 30 minutes. She searched the couch, the kitchen, the bathroom, the fridge. Finally, she called it using her smartwatch, and her phone started ringing. Inside her back pocket, she said, "I swear my butt is pranking me." A blonde went to the library and asked, "Where are the books about ghosts?" The librarian whispered, "Right behind you." The blonde screamed and ran out. A blonde was writing in her diary. She wrote, "Dear diary, I am very proud of myself today. I turned my Wi-Fi back on all by myself." She closed the diary. Then she whispered, "I hope no one ever reads this." She typed it in her notes app too, just to be safe. A blonde took a trip to the mountains and saw a sign that said, "Falling rocks." She asked a hiker, "Where do I return them if I find one?" A blonde tried, using a universal remote. She pointed it at her TV and pressed volume up. Her microwave beeped. She said, "Wow, this thing really is universal." A blonde was jogging and listening to music. She saw a sign that said, "Slow down, children at play." She slowed down and said, "Okay, but where are they? I don't want to run into any invisible kids." A blonde wanted to adopt a cat. The shelter worker asked, "Indoor or outdoor cat?" She said, "Which one comes pre-trained?" A blonde walked into a bakery and asked for a dozen cookies. The cashier packed 12. The blonde said, "I said a dozen." The cashier said, "That is a dozen." The blonde said, "Fine, give me 13 so I know you're not scamming me." A blonde was learning geography. Her friend pointed to a map and said, "This is South America." The blonde asked, "Where's North America then?" Her friend pointed. She said, "Oh, so they're neighbors." A blonde got a job answering phones. Her script said, "Hello, how may I help you?" But she misread it every time as, "Hello, how may I help me?" People were very confused. She was very pleased with herself. A blonde bought new curtains for her house. They came with a label that said, "Machine washable." She said, "Great, now I just need a machine big enough to wash the house." A blonde asked a waiter, "What comes with the spaghetti?" He said, "It comes with garlic bread." She said, "Okay, but what does it leave with?" A blonde was learning to cook rice. The instructions said, "Let it simmer." She stared at it and said, "It just sits there. How do I know if it's thinking deeply?" A blonde bought a new alarm clock. When it first rang at 7 a.m., she threw it against the wall and said, "No, try again tomorrow." A blonde went to a coffee shop and asked for extra hot coffee. The barista asked, "How hot?" She said, "Hot enough that I regret my decisions immediately." A blonde went out in the rain and came back soaked. Her friend said, "Why didn't you use the umbrella I gave you?" She said, "It was raining too hard to open it." A blonde saw a recycling sign that said paper only. So she took her plastic bottles home. Then she threw them in the toilet. She said, "It's like recycling for water bottles." A blonde wanted to learn karate. Her instructor said, "The first step is discipline." She said, "Is there a second step?" A blonde ordered pizza. When it arrived, she asked the delivery guy, "Is it fresh?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Can you prove it?" He bit into a slice. She screamed, "I said prove it, not eat it." A blonde bought a plant. The care instructions said, "Water twice a week." She watered it twice on Monday and said, "See you next week." A blonde was filling out a job application. One question said, "Are you dependable?" She wrote, "Depends on what you need." A blonde called customer service and said, "Your commercial promised fast Wi-Fi." The agent asked, "How slow is your connection?" She said, "I typed www.google.com, and it still hasn't shown me any pictures." A blonde bought a blender and used it to make milkshakes. Her friend said, "You know you can make smoothies too." She said, "With what smooths?" A blonde visited a zoo and saw a sign that said, "Do not tap the glass." She knocked on it gently and said, "But what if I just want to say hi?" A blonde tried to cook soup. The recipe said, "Stir occasionally." She stirred once every 3 hours. She said, "I didn't want to annoy it." A blonde bought wireless headphones. She returned them a day later saying, "They don't work." The cashier asked, "Did you charge them?" She said, "Charge who? The headphones, they're innocent." A blonde looked at a banana and said, "How do they open these things in the jungle?" Her friend said, "Monkeys do it from the bottom." She tried it. It worked. She whispered, "Wow, monkeys are geniuses." A blonde tried yoga. The instructor said, "Take a deep breath." She inhaled dramatically and said, "Okay, but don't expect much more from me today." A blonde asked a doctor, "Do you have medicine for memory loss?" The doctor asked, "Yes, how long have you had it?" She said, "Had what?" A blonde went to a fancy restaurant. When the waiter poured water into her glass, she said, I didn't order this." A blonde saw a sign that said, "Wet floor." She touched it. It was wet. She said, "These signs are incredibly accurate." A blonde called her friend while shopping and said, "I'm trying to find gluten-free bread, but everything here is made of bread." A blonde asked the gym trainer, "If I read a book while running on the treadmill, will my brain also get fit?" A blonde put her phone in airplane mode and threw it in the air. It didn't fly. She said, "This feature is useless." A blonde adopted a puppy and named him Wi-Fi. She said, "Now I can finally say I have strong connection at home." A blonde checked her horoscope. It said, "You will find happiness today." She waited. Nothing happened. She filed an online complaint to the universe. A blonde ordered cheese fries. When they arrived, she said, "Excuse me, the fries are under the cheese." A blonde tried to take a selfie, but her phone storage was full. She whispered, "Okay, I'll just remember this moment manually." A blonde bought a candle that smelled like vanilla. She lit it and said, "Why doesn't my house smell like cake yet?" A blonde thought Wi-Fi stood for "We're in for internet." Her friend said, "That's not what it means." She said, "Fine, then what does Bluetooth mean?" A blonde put her sweater in the dryer and it shrank to half its size. She looked at it and said, "Well, I guess someone getting a new dog sweater." A blonde painted her nails and didn't move for an hour. Her friend asked why. She said, "The bottle says dry thoroughly, I'm being thorough." A blonde saw a message on her microwave that said, "Food is hot." She nodded and said, "Good teamwork." A blonde bought roller skates. She put them on her hands. When asked why, she said, "The box said wrist guards." A blonde decided she wanted to donate blood. When she got to the clinic, the nurse asked, "What's your blood type?" The blonde said, "Oh, I don't know, but I do know my Wi-Fi password." The nurse blinked slowly and said, "That does not help." The blonde nodded and said, I know, but you looked like someone who needed that information. A blonde tried to start a garden. She planted tomatoes, carrots, onions, and cucumbers. A week later, she called her friend crying, "Nothing is growing." Her friend asked, "Did you water them?" The blonde gasped and said, "Water. They didn't come with thirst instructions." A blonde went to a music store because she wanted to learn guitar. The employee asked if she wanted an acoustic or electric guitar. She said, "Which one makes me look like I already know how to play?" A blonde was driving when she saw a flashing sign that said, "Check engine." She pulled over, got out, opened the hood, looked inside, nodded and said, "Yup, it's still there." Then she got back in and kept driving. A blonde tried meditation for the first time. She sat on the floor, crossed her legs, closed her eyes and whispered, "Inner peace, inner peace." After 10 minutes her phone buzzed and she jumped up shouting, "There it is, my inner peace is calling me." A blonde was ordering online and saw express shipping. She clicked it, then called customer service and said, "How fast will it be?" They said, "2 days." She said, "That doesn't sound very expressive." A blonde was filling out a warranty card. The form asked, "Date of purchase." She wrote, "Tuesday." When the store asked her to be more specific, she said, "All right, fine, late Tuesday." A blonde saw a man standing on a ladder painting his house. She yelled, "Hey, you missed a spot." The man looked down and said, "Where?" She pointed randomly and said, "There." He sighed and said, "Ma'am, I'm painting the other side." A blonde got a part-time job at a pizza shop. Her first order said, "Half pepperoni, half cheese." She made 2 pizzas, 1 full pepperoni, 1 full cheese, cut them in half, and taped the halves together. A blonde tried to set up voicemail on her phone. The automated system said, "Please speak after the tone." She whispered, "Tone." A blonde was learning violin. Her instructor said, "You need to practice scales." She asked, like, weighing myself. A blonde bought a smart lamp. She said, "Turn on." Nothing happened. She said louder, "Turn on." Still nothing. She returned it the next day saying, "It only listens when I talk to myself." A blonde was learning to make pancakes. She read the recipe, "Flip when bubbles appear." She stared at the pan, saw bubbles and screamed, "They're coming alive." A blonde called 911 because her freezer was making a weird sound. The dispatcher asked, "What kind of sound?" She said, "Like cold." A blonde tried to download a movie, but her internet was slow. She said, I should have bought the faster Wi-Fi flavor." Her friend said, "You mean speed, not flavor." She said, "Please don't ruin this for me." A blonde got lost in a shopping mall and called her friend asking, "Where am I?" Her friend said, "What store are you near?" The blonde said, "A mirror." Her friend said, "And what's next to it?" She said, "Me, I already told you." A blonde read an article that said, "Walking reduces stress." She walked around the living room twice and said, "Nope, still stressed." A blonde bought a calendar. When she opened it, she said, "Oh nice, it comes with free pictures." A blonde got a job as a receptionist. Her boss asked her to take minutes at a meeting. 20 minutes later, she came back and said, "Okay, I took 20, how many more do you need?" A blonde was taking a bath when the power went out. She panicked, called her friend and whispered, "I'm stuck." Her friend asked, "How are you stuck?" She said, "It's dark, I can't find the towel." A blonde bought a smart thermostat. She set it to 22 degrees. An hour later, she called tech support and said, "It still feels like my house is inside my house." A blonde was learning to text with emojis. She sent her friend a message that said, "See you soon," followed by 6 skulls. Her friend called her screaming, "Why skulls?" She said, "I thought it meant excitement." A blonde tried to use a password manager. It suggested a strong password, XJ4L3N9. She wrote it down and labeled it password for password manager password. She lost the note the next day. A blonde bought new glasses. The optician asked, "Can you read the letters on the wall?" She said, "I can read the wall." The optician asked, "And the letters?" She said, "Let's not rush things." A blonde tried to set a reminder on her phone. She said, "Remind me to go to the appointment." The phone said, "When?" She said, "When I forget." A blonde got locked inside her car. She called her friend and said, "Help, the door won't open." Her friend asked, "Did you try unlocking it?" She said, "Well, no, I didn't want to break the lock." A blonde dropped her sandwich on the floor and yelled, "NOOO." Her friend said, "Just pick it up." She said, "I can't, the 5-second rule is strict." A blonde tried to bake bread. The recipe said, "Let rise for 1 hour." She stared at it for 1 hour and said, "It didn't rise, should I encourage it?" A blonde was learning photography. When someone blinked in a photo, she said, "It's okay, I'll Photoshop their eyes open." A minute later she said, "Do you know where their eyes are stored?" A blonde bought a vacuum cleaner. She returned it the next day saying, "It doesn't work." The clerk asked, "Did you plug it in?" She said, "Plug it into what?" A blonde wanted to save money, so she cancelled her gym membership. Then she started jogging in place in her living room, but kept crashing into the couch. She whispered, "Gyms are so much safer." A blonde tried to fold a fitted sheet. After 10 minutes, she rolled it into a ball and whispered, "Nobody will ever know." A blonde tried to cook pasta, but kept burning it. Her friend said, "Why don't you try using a timer?" She said, "I do, but it always interrupts me." A blonde got a message that her package was delayed due to weather. She went outside, looked at the sky and said, "Okay weather, you win this round." A blonde called tech support and said, "My laptop doesn't turn on." They asked, "Is it plugged in?" She said, "I'm on the couch." They said, "But the computer." She said, "It's on the couch too." A blonde tried to return a mirror saying, "It's broken." The employee asked, "How do you know?" She said, "Every time I look at it, the person inside copies me." A blonde tried to learn Morse code. After 10 minutes she said, "This is just dots and lines. I wanted something more advanced like hieroglyphics." A blonde asked her friend, "Is the moon bigger than the sun?" Her friend said, "No." The blonde said, "Then why can I look at the moon without sunglasses?" A blonde tried to friendzone a guy politely. She said, "I like you like a cousin." He said, "That's weird." She said, "Okay, like a cousin I don't talk to." A blonde was learning to make smoothies. She put fruit, yogurt, milk and ice in the blender, turned it on and suddenly screamed. Her friend ran in and asked, "What HAPPNED?" She said, "I forgot to put the lid on, and my kitchen is now strawberry flavored." A blonde asked a cashier, "If I buy one shoe today and the other tomorrow, is that considered a pair?" A blonde tried to make a backup of her phone. She put it behind her, turned around and said, "Look, it's backed up." A blonde bought wireless earbuds. She only used one because she said, "I don't want the sound to get tangled." A blonde was watching a documentary on whales and said, "Wow, I didn't know they were that big in real life." A blonde thought the phrase, "sleeping like a baby," meant waking up every 2 hours. She said, "That sounds awful. I sleep like a teenager, dead to the world." A blonde got a message on her car's dashboard that said, "Low fuel." She said, "Wow, my car is really honest with me." A blonde tried to microwave popcorn. She put it in the microwave, but forgot to remove it from the plastic bag. When it exploded, she shouted, "It's snowing corn." A blonde asked the dentist, "Does toothpaste expire?" The dentist said, "Yes." She said, "Oh no, I've been using vintage toothpaste." A blonde was planning a vacation. The travel site asked, "How many adults?" She wrote, "Hopefully just one." A blonde was reading a cooking blog. It said, "Don't overthink it, just follow your heart." She put her ear to the grill and listened carefully. A blonde went to a comedy show. After the performance, everyone clapped except her. Her friend asked why. She said, "I don't want his ego to get too big." A blonde bought a whiteboard but returned it saying, "It doesn't work." The clerk asked, "Did you try using markers?" She said, "Markers, I thought it was voice activated." A blonde saw a sign that said, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." She whispered, I hate medical procedures." A blonde put her clothes in the washer, added detergent, pressed on, and then stood staring at the machine. Her roommate said, "Why are you watching it wash?" She said, "It says supervised cycle. Am I supposed to supervise?" A blonde got a message that said, "Software update available." She sighed and said, "And I was finally starting to trust it." A blonde went to a furniture store and told the salesman she needed a new bed. He asked what size, twin, full, queen, or king. She frowned and said, "Well, I'm not royalty, so maybe full." The salesman blinked twice and said, "Full it is." A blonde decided to start journaling to keep track of her thoughts. Her first entry said, "Dear Diary, I think my memory is improving. I remember forgetting things much faster now." A blonde bought a smartwatch that tracks steps. After one day she complained, "This thing is broken. I walked around the entire living room 3 times and it only said 14 steps. Do couches count as teleportation?" A blonde walked into her house holding a huge watermelon. Her friend asked, "Why did you buy such a big one?" She said, "It said seedless. I wanted to see how it grew without seeds." A blonde tried one of those online IQ tests. When she finished, it said, "Your result, loading." She proudly said, "Wow, even my brain needs time to load. I must be advanced." A blonde bought rollerblades and tried them inside the house. She kept crashing into furniture and yelled, "Why is my house not skater-friendly?" A blonde was knitting a sweater. Her friend said, "Wow, you're almost done. Who is it for?" She shrugged and said, "I don't know. It depends who fits into this shape." A blonde tried to make chocolate chip cookies, but forgot the chocolate chips. When they finished baking, she said, "Maybe the chips melted into the spiritual dimension." A blonde received a notification on her phone that said, "Your screen time last week was 12 hours per day." She said, "No, that's impossible. I sleep with my eyes closed." A blonde was watching a video tutorial on how to fix a sink. Halfway through, she said, "This is exhausting. I'll just call a plumber." But she still finished the video because he seemed nice. A blonde got stuck in a drive-thru because the speaker wasn't working. She kept repeating her order louder and louder until someone behind her came up and said, "Ma'am, you have to drive up to the window now." A blonde bought new slippers but returned them because they didn't make my feet feel like I was walking on clouds. When the clerk asked what clouds feel like, she said, "Soft disappointment." A blonde decided to start doing yoga every morning. Her first session lasted 10 seconds because she said, "My spine isn't flexible enough for enlightenment yet." A blonde saw a sign in a store window that said, "Everything must go." She walked in, pointed at the cashier and said, "You first." A blonde tried to use a QR code at a restaurant. She held her phone near it and whispered, "Eat this." A blonde walked into a salon and asked for a haircut that makes me look smarter. The stylist gave her glasses. A blonde tried driving using Google Maps, but she kept getting lost because she said, "The arrow moves too much. I can't read while I'm moving." A blonde friend asked her, "Do you know the Wi-Fi password?" She said, "Yes, but I can't tell you." Her friend said, "Why not?" She said, "Because it says, don't share your password." A blonde bought a plant and named it photosynthesis. She said, "It sounds like a wizard's name." A blonde went camping for the first time. She stared at the tent instructions and said, "Why don't they come pre-installed?" A blonde tried to set up two-factor authentication. She added her phone number and it said, "Verification code sent." She looked at her phone and said, "Can you at least warn me before sending something scary like that?" A blonde was learning CPR, and when the instructor said, "Push hard and fast," she nervously said, "That's what got me in trouble last time." A blonde bought an expensive perfume because the salesperson said it had notes of jasmine. Later she complained, "I keep sniffing but I hear no notes." A blonde tried to use an ATM but walked away angry because it kept asking for PIN, but I don't know its PIN. A blonde was watching a crime show. She said, "If I ever committed a crime, I would leave immediately after doing it." A blonde tried to refill her water bottle in a public bathroom, but the automatic faucet wouldn't turn on. She waved left, right, up, down, and whispered, "Open sesame." Her friend said, "Just put your hands under it." She said, "But it says automatic." A blonde bought an alarm clock that projects the time onto the ceiling. The first night she woke up at 3 a.m. screaming, "Who put that number in my room?" A blonde visited a psychic who said, "I see you making a big change soon." The blonde gasped and said, "OMG, am I finally switching shampoos?" A blonde was reading a recipe that said separate eggs. She put one egg on one side of the counter and the other egg on the other side and said, "Now behave." A blonde was shopping for a toaster and asked, "Do you have anything that toasts evenly?" The employee said, "This one is good." She shook her head and said, "No, I want something that only burns the parts I don't like." A blonde was trying to choose a bottled water. She picked one up and read the label, "Purified through reverse osmosis." She said, "Reverse osmosis, that means they undid osmosis, right? Is that safe?" A blonde was confused by the instructions on instant noodles. Cook for 3 minutes. She said, 3 minutes from when? When they were packaged. A blonde was stargazing with her boyfriend. She pointed to a star and said, "Make a wish." He said, "Okay." She whispered, "But not too loud, it'll hear you." A blonde tried using Uber but got frustrated because the map kept moving. She shouted, "Stop running away from me." A blonde saw a sign that said, "No soliciting." She told her friend, "I don't know what soliciting is, but I'm glad they don't allow it." A blonde got a manicure and panicked when the nail tech used a UV lamp. She said, "I didn't bring sunscreen." A blonde was reading the weather forecast. It said, "Chance of rain, 40%. She said, "That means 60% chance of nothing happening." A blonde got a message that her storage was full on her phone. She deleted the weather app because "I can look outside." A blonde asked the barista for a latte with extra foam. When she got it, she said, "This drink has no privacy, I can see everything." A blonde tried to cook chicken. The recipe said, "Season generously." She said, "Okay," and said to the chicken, "You look amazing today." A blonde told her friend she got a raise. Her friend said, "Congratulations, how much?" She said, "Enough to be slightly happier, but not enough to brag about." A blonde was confused by the phrase, "The early bird gets the worm." She said, "Why would a bird want worms? Why not breakfast cereal?" A blonde was trying to take a picture of a sunset, but her phone died. She said, "I guess I'll just remember it the old-fashioned way, through trauma." A blonde deleted her browser history and said, "Now no one will know I searched for why cats stare at walls." A blonde got stuck in a hammock and yelled, "Help, I'm in a cotton spiderweb." A blonde took a cooking class. The instructor said, "Always taste as you go." She tasted everything except the food. When asked why, she said, "I doubt myself a lot." A blonde was using a treadmill. She pressed the button that said "Quick Start," and when it started too fast, she said, "Too quick, too quick." A blonde was learning to swim and said, "I can float, but I can't sink. Is that a problem?" A blonde tried learning calligraphy. After 1 minute, she said, "I think my handwriting is allergic to beauty." A blonde said she drinks only filtered water. When asked why, she said, "I don't want to drink anything that's been inside another pipe." A blonde tried to use a self-checkout machine. The machine said, "Unexpected item in the bagging area." She said, "Yes, me." A blonde had an interview where the employer asked, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" She said, "Probably still here, answering questions." A blonde tried learning origami. The instructor said, "Fold the paper in half." She said, "Which half?" A blonde said she loves nature. Her friend said, "Name a tree." She said, "Green." A blonde tried to do laundry but accidentally washed her headphones. She said, "At least now they're clean for when I listen to sad songs." A blonde bought noise-canceling headphones. She put them on and said, "Wow, the world stopped judging me." A blonde read the label on a bottle of soda that said, "Best by October 2025. She said, "What happens if I drink it in November? Do I die?" A blonde tried to scan a QR code on her laptop screen using her laptop camera. After 10 tries, she said, "Maybe the laptop doesn't want to work with itself." A blonde was crossing the street and saw a sign that said, "Walk." She said, "Thank you for the encouragement." A blonde said she started intermittent fasting. Her friend asked, "What's your schedule?" She said, "I eat when I'm hungry and stop when I forget." A blonde bought sunglasses because she said, "The sun keeps staring at me." A blonde went to the zoo and saw a giraffe. She said, "If I had a neck like that, I'd never lose a scarf." A blonde saw a sign that said, "Slow children at play." She whispered, "Wow, they're really honest in this neighborhood." A blonde was reading a book and someone asked her what it was about. She said, "Words, lots of them." A blonde asked her doctor, "Is it possible to gain weight from thinking about food?" A blonde bought a bird feeder and put it in her living room. She waited 2 days and said, "Why haven't the birds come inside?" A blonde bought a compass because she wanted to find herself. A blonde tried to toast bread but put the bread on top of the toaster instead of inside. When nothing happened, she said, "Wow, this toaster is so lazy." A blonde saw a sign that said, "Employees must wash hands before returning to work." She whispered, "So, if I don't work here, I don't have to wash my hands." A blonde was trying to understand the stock market. She asked her friend, "If I buy a stock, does it come in a box?" A blonde visited a lighthouse and asked the tour guide, "Does it only work at night?" The guide said, "Well, yes." She said, "Oh, okay, I just didn't want the light to get tired." A blonde went to the doctor because her arm hurt every time she touched it. She said, "Look, I touch my shoulder and it hurts. I touch my leg and it hurts. I touch my head and it hurts." The doctor examined her and said, "Your finger is broken." A blonde got a flat tire and called roadside assistance. The operator asked, "Do you know the make and model of your car?" She said, "Yes, it's blue." A blonde was learning how sushi is made. After watching the chef cut fish, she said, "Wow, so sushi is like a salad but with ocean vegetables." A blonde tried installing a ceiling fan. She got on a ladder, held the fan above her head, looked down and said, "Now what?" A blonde bought a hair dryer with a cool shot button. She pressed it and said, "Wow, instant AC." A blonde saw a sign outside a restaurant that said, "Kids eat free." She walked in and asked, "Do I have to bring my own kid, or do you provide one?" A blonde was at the airport and saw a sign that said, "Departures." She said, "That's rude, people are sensitive." A blonde bought a slow cooker. She called customer support and said, "I've been watching it for 3 hours and it hasn't moved once." A blonde tried to follow a recipe that said, "Garnish with cilantro." She sprinkled salt on the plate and said, "Close enough." A blonde tried to print a document, but the printer kept saying, "Paper jam." She gasped and said, "OMG, the printer likes music." A blonde wanted to get in shape, so she bought a jump rope. She returned it the next day saying, "It doesn't jump." A blonde got a new mirror. Her friend asked, "Where are you going to hang it?" She said, "Probably somewhere it won't judge me." A blonde tried to make iced coffee. She poured coffee over ice cubes, then sat staring at the cup for 10 minutes and said, "It's still too hot. Maybe the ice is shy." A blonde asked her friend, "If I stand next to a smart person, do I level up?" A blonde attended a wedding, and when the priest said, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," she raised her hand and asked, "Can someone explain the plot so far?" A blonde got confused by her car's blinker. She said, "I click it left, but it keeps turning off by itself. This car has trust issues." A blonde went to a psychic and asked, "Can you tell me what I'm thinking?" The psychic said, "No one can." A blonde was trying to buy travel insurance. She asked the agent, "Does this cover bad decisions?" A blonde baked a cake, and when she cut into it, she said, "It's hollow inside. My cake has trust issues." A blonde read a headline that said, "Scientists discover water on Mars." She said, "I hope they wipe it up. Someone could slip." A blonde tried to learn how to whistle. She blew air for 10 minutes and said, "Maybe my mouth is defective." A blonde was reading a magazine in the checkout line. The cover said, "Lose 10 pounds fast." She put it back and said, "If it worked, the magazine would be thinner." A blonde tried using voice commands with her TV. She said, "TV, turn on." Nothing happened. She whispered, "Please." It still didn't turn on. She said, "Wow, even electronics ignore me." A blonde painted her bedroom blue. Her friend said, "Why blue?" She said, "Because white was already taken by the walls." A blonde took a CPR course. When she practiced chest compressions, the instructor said, "Faster." She said, "If I go faster, I'll spill my coffee." A blonde went on a road trip. She packed sunscreen, snacks, a blanket, a book, a pillow, a flashlight, and her passport. Her friend said, "We're not leaving the country." She said, "Well, not with that attitude." A blonde bought a scale that measures body fat. She stepped on it, looked down, gasped, and said, "How does it know that?" A blonde wanted to learn to dance. She watched a tutorial and said, "The steps are easy, the hard part is moving my body." A blonde tried aromatherapy. She smelled lavender and said, "Yep, smells like purple." A blonde got a text message that said, "You've won a free cruise." She replied, "Nice try, ocean scammers." A blonde bought a telescope but returned it because she couldn't find any celebrities. A blonde tried to cook rice in the microwave. The container melted. She said, "I think the microwave was hungry." A blonde asked her friend, "If plants need sunlight, do they get depressed at night?" A blonde tried to rent a movie online. The site asked for her password. She typed, "Movie please 123." When it didn't work, she said, "Wow, this site is rude." A blonde was playing chess with her friend. After losing, she said, "Let's play checkers. It's the simpler cousin of chess." A blonde asked her doctor, "Is caffeine a vitamin?" A blonde went to bed early to be more productive. 3 hours later, she was still scrolling memes. She said, I think my productivity is broken. A blonde bought a humidifier and a dehumidifier. When asked why, she said, I want to see which one wins. A blonde received a letter that said, do not bend. She folded it and put it in her pocket saying, watch me. A blonde tried to hang a picture frame but kept hammering the nails sideways. Her friend said, try a different angle. She said, okay, and turned her head sideways. A blonde asked the dentist, why do you call them wisdom teeth? Mine didn't teach me anything. A blonde was told her phone had a low battery. She said, same. A blonde was warned that a certain neighborhood had potholes. She drove slowly looking for pots. She said, who keeps leaving cookware on the street? A blonde ordered sushi for the first time. She asked the waiter, is the fish cooked? He said, no. She said, is the rice cooked? He said, yes. She said, okay, I'll just eat the rice. A blonde had to fill out a form asking for place of birth. She wrote hospital. A blonde tried to call her friend but forgot her friend's number. She said, I wish you had a name I could Google. A blonde bought a self-help book titled Be Your Best Self. She opened its side and said, too much pressure. A blonde visited a lake and asked, is the water natural or artificial? A blonde saw a sign that said sale, buy one, get one free. She picked up one shoe and said, free shoe, please. A blonde tried to take a photo of the moon, but it looked tiny in the picture. She said, why does my phone hate astronomy? A blonde tasted spicy food and said, it tastes like anger. A blonde bought a globe and said, it's like Earth but portable. A blonde saw a sign that said, mind the step. She looked at the step and said, you're doing great. A blonde tried buying a book online. The website asked for her email. She typed, no. A blonde named her Wi-Fi network, no Wi-Fi here, and got mad when her neighbors stopped asking for the password. A blonde tried putting gas in her car, but couldn't open the fuel door. She said, I guess it only drinks on weekends. A blonde saw a documentary about sharks. She said they should teach sharks to eat less people. A blonde tried filling out her tax return. She wrote none of your business on every line. A blonde tried to fix her internet by unplugging the router. She waited 3 seconds and plugged it back in. She said, if technology can't heal fast, it shouldn't be in my house. A blonde bought a book called Understanding Humans. She returned it saying it didn't help. A blonde tried to meditate with a guided audio track. When the narrator said, clear your mind, she said, how? A blonde bought noise-canceling headphones. She put them on and said, I still hear my thoughts, refund. A blonde saw a sign that said, no littering. She said, I wasn't planning on adopting a cat. A blonde tried to buy a lottery ticket. She asked the cashier, can I choose winning numbers only? A blonde saw a map of the world and said, wow, Earth is way bigger than I thought. A blonde asked her friend, if I save money by not buying things, shouldn't the store pay me? A blonde said she's allergic to mornings. Her friend said, that's not a thing. She said, then why do I break out in grumpiness? A blonde bought a blender and blended an avocado pit because it looked lonely. A blonde got stuck in an elevator and said, at least this is a great opportunity to work on my vertical patience. A blonde was asked to bring something to the potluck. She brought a fork. A blonde tried running but stopped after 10 seconds and said, my body said nope. A blonde saw a sign that said, restrooms. She said, finally, a place for my room to rest. A blonde thought her microwave was spying on her. She covered it with a towel and whispered, you hear nothing. A blonde got a package in the mail and screamed because boxes shouldn't knock. A blonde saw a rainbow and said, Earth is leveling up. A blonde tried to make tea. She boiled water and poured it over the tea bag, but didn't remove the wrapper. She said the paper adds texture. A blonde asked her friend, if humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Her friend said, that's not how evolution works. She said, okay, but answer the question. A blonde sent a text that autocorrected incorrectly. She threw her phone down and said, this is why we can't have smart things. A blonde tried ordering online but kept clicking add to wish list instead of add to cart. She said, why doesn't it understand my wishes? A blonde tried eating healthier and bought kale. She took one bite and said, no wonder leaves fall off trees. A blonde asked her doctor, is it possible to be addicted to oxygen? A blonde said she's going to drink more water. She filled a wine glass with water and said, I'm staying classy. A blonde tried reading an encyclopedia but quit after page 3 because she said, this book has too many facts. A blonde bought a hamster. She asked the pet store employee, does it come with instructions? A blonde watched a science documentary and said, atoms are so cute, they're always bonding. A blonde was shocked when she learned how long pregnancy lasts. She said, 9 months, why not make it shorter like a subscription trial? A blonde bought a backpack and said, now my shoulders have pockets. A blonde went to a fancy restaurant and ordered sparkling water. When it arrived, she said, it tastes like static. A blonde learned about photosynthesis and said, if plants can make their own food, why don't they make mine? A blonde bought a Fitbit. After one day, she said, it keeps telling me to move, this thing is bossy. A blonde saw a sign that said, beware of dog. She whispered, thanks for the warning sign. A blonde tried learning to juggle. She dropped everything 5 times and said, I think gravity dislikes me. A blonde saw a cloud shaped like a bunny and said, nature is an artist. A blonde tried expressing gratitude every morning. She said, today I am grateful for socks. A blonde took a group photo and said, okay everyone, try to look like someone else is holding the camera. A blonde tried to order a drink at a bar. The bartender said, name. She said, yours.